Let me first of all thank the organizers for inviting me here today, and most importantly, my friend Chuma Anosike, who was on my case to make sure that I come to Namibia. So thank you for the opportunity, and I welcome this wholeheartedly. By way of background, my name is Simbi Wabote. I am an engineer by training, an oil and gas practitioner for 26 years. I worked for Shell, not surprising, as a surface engineer and built lots of kits as well as surface facilities. And I've been around the world where I've done a lot for Shell. And my last assignment internationally was in Dubai, where I spent a couple of years developing specifically a global local content strategy for Shell as a company to deal with the challenges Shell faced in the Middle East, in Australia, in Canada, in America, in terms of ensuring local participation in the oil and gas sector. In 2016, I was appointed to lead the Nigerian Content Development and Monitoring Board. While I was still serving Shell, I left Shell as a director of the company after 26 years. So please don't look at me that I'm a young man. I've been around for a while, and I've paid my dues in the oil and gas sector. I bring you greetings from the good people of Nigeria and also from the management and staff of the Nigerian Content Development and Monitoring Board. It is, like I said, my honor and privilege for me to be part of this august gathering of captains of the oil and gas industry to discuss the outlook and the various opportunities as Namibia transits into the oil and gas producing nation. Namibia had witnessed a very remarkable oil and gas discoveries in the last few years, which indeed presents a lot of excitement and anticipation as espoused by the speakers this morning, ranging from plan on when to retire, how many wives perhaps to take, how many children to have, and all whatnot. It's indeed a very good excitement that you look forward to. I wish Namibia produced oil before Nigeria. That would have paid me more in terms of getting into all those plans. It is very commendable that this type of conference is being organized to get inputs from various stakeholders as you prepare to explore and exploit these resources for the greater good of the society. In the morning, when some of the speakers were on the panel, they talked about how many years it took Nigeria to enact the local content law, having explored and exploited hydrocarbon for almost 50 years before we got the ball on what to do with regards to local participation. And indeed, that is not what Nigeria wished for Namibia. You must learn from experience, you must learn from the mistakes, and you must turn that around into your benefit. I see some of the examples that were shared by some of the consultants on the issue of resource costs. And they mentioned Nigeria and they mentioned Angola. But it's also sad to note that they did not share the story about the resource benefits. Examples are Saudi Arabia today. They've turned the country into what we all see out of the resources they have. Qatar is a typical example. with 2.6 million people, even with Namibia with 2 million people. Today, look at their GDP, look at their development, it is all out of the oil and gas resources. So please, don't just take the negative, also look at the positive. It took us those 50 years because we had consultants who were giving us the negative story of if you do local content, what will happen to you. We have most of those consultants in the spirit of transparency, also paid by the big oil companies to come to conferences like this and continue to give us the negative perspective without talking about the positives. So it is important that when you invite those consultants, ask them to give you a balanced view, where it has worked, where it has not worked. Yes, resource costs. Go to the country that invented that word resource costs. They turned around their fortune because of the gas and oil they discovered in those countries. I tell you what, the big companies will pay these consultants to continue to pass this message to you as to the dangers of oil and gas exploration. And I ask myself, Namibia is not new to extractive industry. I understand that uranium is actively extracted from here. Let the community ask themselves, what have they benefited for these huge mining companies? But today we are discussing oil and gas. It is the demon that we continue to look at. In today's earlier session of the conference, it was a delight to listen to the various perspectives of governance, economic, sustainability, and the various strategies to position Namibia as a global energy player. The section of the conference is dedicated, this section is dedicated to oil and gas learnings and case studies. My task, therefore, as a regulator perspective, as regards local content policy and practice in Nigeria. Thus, the focus of my presentation at this session of the conference is as follows. Give a brief highlight of ever-evolving hydrocarbon landscape in Africa. Provide an overview of the key parameters that are required for achieving sustainable local content practice in the oil and gas sector. And also describe how Nigeria has deployed these parameters in our oil and gas sector and share lessons we have learned in our local content journey. Over the course of 4 decades, the number of African countries with proven oil and gas reserves have more than doubled. If you look at this map, the first one you can see my left, your right. In 1975, you can count how many African countries have oil and gas. In 1985, you can see the numbers. In 1995, you can see the numbers. And today, in 2023, the whole African continent itself is rich in the oil and gas resource. Yet, Africa is still struggling on how to come out of the pit that it finds itself. Therefore, Africa holds today about 10% of the global crude oil reserves, and she currently produces about 12% of the annual global oil production. Despite this significant level of production, Africa's share of the global annual oil consumption is less than 4%. Despite all these that you have, it's less than 4%. This means that Africa consumes on 1/3 of its production despite the prevalent challenges of energy, availability, accessibility, and affordability. These facts highlights some of the potential opportunities that exist for Africa, not only in production of oil and gas, but also in the processing and utilization within the continent for improvement in the standard of living. Only 3 weeks ago, if I am right, the UK government decided to give out 100 mining leases in the North Sea. Yet today, we're talking about laws that should prevent us from doing what we're doing. Sustainable local content practice represents the surest route to achieve in-country value addition to maximize the benefit of exploitation of hydrocarbon resources. The quantum of composite value added to are created in the local economy by a systematic development of capacity and capabilities through deliberate utilization of local human, material resources and services. The practice of local content in the oil and gas industry, and indeed any sector, entails the employment of 6 key parameters as follows: regulatory framework, gap analysis, I think somebody talked about it, capacity building, funding and incentives, research and development, as well as access to market. In the next few slides, I'll briefly describe each of these parameters, the achievements we have so far realized in Nigeria, and the lessons we have learned in the process. The whole idea is to ensure that Namibia does not make the mistakes that we made. Namibia does not get into the pit hole that we found ourselves for 50 years, that we are being told, if you have enact the Local Content Act, the whole world will collapse. We have operated it for almost 12 years successfully, and we have developed Nigerian capabilities. The first parameter for any world-class local content structure is a regulatory framework. An enabling regulatory framework backed with the appropriate legislation is very fundamental in local content practice. A law or decree, depending on the political arrangement in a country, sets the framework and boundaries for all local content practitioners. This is better than directives or policies that are subject to speculation or compliance on best endeavor basis. In Nigeria, we started with a policy. I was working for Shell, and Shell, to be fair, tried to push those policies to see how far it would take them. But when it got to a particular point, they turn around and say there is no legal basis to implement what you are asking, because it was a policy. In Nigeria, we have the Logic Act 2010 in place. It is no longer optional or debatable whether to comply with local content requirements. The Act establishes the Nigerian Content Development and Monitoring Board as the sole agency for local content implementation in the oil and gas industry. Of course, it is an independent regulatory body, just like said by some of the panel members. In fact, the new Petroleum Act fully reinforces the practice of local content in the industry and has further extended the remit of oversight of the Local Content Board to the approvals of field development plans, so that local content consideration are taken into consideration from inception. And I think Ranti made the point. The fields we are talking about are almost 250 kilometers offshore Namibia. Most of us will not see those activities. It will happen 250 kilometers. Some of the services will be procured from where they have established logistic bases. You will only hear that these gentlemen that work in the oil and gas industry took helicopter flights to the airport and went back to their countries. You will not see anything because it's 250 kilometers offshore Namibia. One of the provisions of the NOGIC Act is that first consideration shall be given to Nigerian operators in the award of blocks and licenses, Nigerian goods and services, and the employment and training of Nigerians. We have deployed these provisions in the law to ensure that patronage of Nigerian business with the requisite capacity to deliver. Similarly, we have used it to create sizable number of indigenous operators from regular bid rounds and asset divestment by international oil companies. A typical example is a company we call Seplat. When they acquired the asset that was left by Shell, it was producing 10,000 barrels per day. But an indigenous company, 99% Nigerians, took that asset. Today, they are aiming to produce 100,000 barrels per day. However, some of the key lessons under the regulatory environment parameters are as follows. The law must promote and enable investments rather than become a stumbling block to existing or new investors, both locally and internationally. No law is perfect. Put the law in place and amend the law as necessary rather than waiting to get everyone's buy-in. It took us more than 15 years to put in place the Petroleum Act 2021, yet we already have some stakeholders agitating for its amendment. Provisions should be made in the law to address any lacuna without having to review the entire law, such as the provision of the NOGIC Act for utilization of ministerial regulations to address any gaps or opportunities. You will never get a perfect law. Don't wait for it. While the law may not necessarily be all-encompassing, consideration should be given to its linkage to other key sectors of the economy rather than just oil and gas. As a regulator, you must be pragmatic in applying the law, as the oil and gas industry is very dynamic, such that aspirational goals and prevailing realities are not always the same in the same trajectory. The second parameter of sustainable world-class local content practice is gap analysis. It is often said that if you cannot measure it, you cannot control it. Baseline and periodic gap analysis are essential to determine gaps that are needed to be closed in the area of skills, facilities, and infrastructure. Regular reviews and monitoring of local content goals show where capacities have been met, where there are gaps, and where capacity upgrade is required to guide the deployment of resources and investment decisions. Let me highlight that this parameter is very key, especially for new players in the oil and gas industry such as Namibia. The gaps to be closed must be driven by local circumstance aspirations. It is human capacity development, employment, development of local service industries, infrastructure, local manufacture, or put in place sovereign wealth fund. Let me highlight that local content is not a one-size-fits-all. What is applicable in Brazil, what is applicable in Nigeria or in Norway is not what you can cut and paste in Namibia. It has to be context-driven. You have to study the environment before you come up with a local content law that is applicable to Namibia. A lot of people say, oh, go and look at Norway example. Go and look at example in Qatar. When I was asked by Shell to develop a strategy for Qatar local content when I was in the Middle East, I went there and they told me to say, look, our problem is not about employment. 2.6 million people with this kind of GDP, we're not looking for employment. But our own local content is how all manufacturing concerns will be domiciled in Qatar and not anywhere else. That's their own local content challenge. Well, I've been pushed a time of timing. Unfortunately, I spent 2 days getting to Namibia. And if I can't finish what I prepared, then it is very sad. For us in Nigeria, we set aspirational targets as contained in the schedule of the Local Content Act. The NOGIC Act has set minimum targets in 278 service categories across oil and gas value chain, to enhance participation of local businesses in the oil and gas supply chain and its linkage sector. 6 years ago, we launched our 10-year strategic roadmap to move Nigerian content in the oil and gas sector to 70% by the year 2027. Based on our monitoring of the industry, we have moved Nigerian content from less than 5% when we started in 2010 to 54% as at the end of 2022. Various strategic initiatives are being implemented to ensure that the goal is achieved. Key lessons we have learned as regards the gap analysis parameters are as follows. It is good to have baseline data, if available, in-country capacity and capabilities to identify the existing gaps and set the targets for gap closure. There is need to strike a balance between aspirational goals and realistic target setting. Both are important in driving investment, motivation, and taking cognizance of local peculiarities. Put in place credible action plans and initiatives to close gaps identified, all driven and tracked by a functional project management office. All gaps cannot be closed overnight, even if you have the resource to do it. Prioritize areas of high impact and deploy prudent implementation measures. Put in place some legal instrument to protect and give effect to the goals you choose to pursue. Some have it as royal decrees, act of parliament, or even written in their constitution. Parameter number 3, which is capacity building. Structured capacity building intervention is essential to spur the development of in-country capacities and capabilities. These are largely driven interventions to close identified gaps in human capacity development, local business development, as well as national development. Since the Act came into effect, we have developed 2 world-class pipe mills and 5 pipe coating plants, grown fabrication capacity from less than 5,000 metric tons per annum to 250,000 metric tons per annum, and have capacity to carry out over 80% of engineering design in-country. We have created 30,000 direct jobs, delivered over 15 million training man-hours, and awarded over 90% of contracts to Nigerian-owned businesses, utilized expatriate management system to ensure more than 80% of our oil company management positions are held by Nigerians. Witness the growth of successful indigenous operators, now responsible for the production of more than 50% of Nigerian domestic gas requirements. Registered over 10,000 service companies participating in the oil and gas supply chain. Our capacity building efforts resulted in the development of a world-class FPSO integration facility, wherein the Egina FPSO, the biggest FPSO today in the world, was integrated, the first of its achievements in Africa. The lessons learned under capacity building parameter are as follows. Implementation of major projects are very important in the development of in-country capacities and capabilities. Project-based training are an important element of human capacity development. Cautious and well-sequenced team of major projects are important to sustain utilization of established capacity and extract additional investment for growth. It is important to mention that local content is not about Namibianization or Nigerianization. It's more about domiciliation and domestication of services that will support the oil and gas industry. I think this is a very important point to make. The 4th parameter is funding and incentives. Funding and incentives are essential to implement local content programs, develop infrastructure, attract new investment, and keep existing businesses afloat where required. Section 104 of the NOGIC Act makes provision for the establishment of a fund known as the Nigerian Content Development Fund for the purpose of funding the implementation of Nigerian content development in the oil and gas industry. Specifically, the sum of 1% of every contract awarded to contractor, subcontractor, alliance partner, or any other entity involved in any project operations or activities or transaction in the upstream sector of the Nigerian oil and gas industry shall be deducted as source and paid into the fund. Funding is a key parameter to develop local businesses. To date, the fund has been deployed in the following areas. We launched the 350 million Nigerian Content Intervention Fund in partnership with Bank of Industry and Exim Bank. Ongoing development of Nigerian Oil and Gas Park Scheme as manufacturing hubs. Construction of our 17-story headquarters building, complete with 1,000-seater international conference center. Partnership with project promoters in the establishment of modular refineries, gas-based industry, and other hydrocarbon processing facilities. We have also become self-funding and exited our annual budgeting process. The lessons learned under the fund parameters are followed. A clear, unambiguous source of fund provisions backed by law is essential to drive local content goals, because if you leave that to local businesses, to go to local banks to borrow, where most of the times the interest rate is 22, 23%, they cannot compete with the international business. So the fund we provide is single digit, 8% interest, all inclusive. It doesn't matter what the central bank does or what the economic body does, whether they increase the decimal point or not. 8% payment, single legal limit of $10 million, and for 5 years period to pay back, to support local businesses to be able to provide services for the oil and gas industry. I wish to, because of the problem director, let me skip some of the points there, but of course my paper is available to share. In Nigeria, the following lessons are important with regards to research and development parameters. It is important that while you depend on the international oil company, you must use the fund that you have to establish a research and development center within Namibia. Because if you don't, you will continue to depend on their technology. So some of the initiatives require dedicated source of funding. For example, a key funding provision during the bidding round in Brazil is that concessionaires are required to spend 1% of gross revenue on research and development. Research and development fairs also provide a platform for institutions and academia to come together in order to look at industry problems to solve them. An example of Brazil, when Brazil started, it was just Petrobras when they started the local content policy. And they did develop Brazil because it was a policy that encompasses beyond the oil and gas sector. So they used it to turn around the Brazilian economy. But immediately they opened up for other operators to come in, Shell, Chevron, Total, and Exxon. The language did change. Those ones went and influenced the process and said, look, local content is not about local content, but it's more about the lowest bidder. And hence, that process is challenged because they were able to influence the process. But when it was only Petrobras, the policy remained and turned around the Brazilian industry. The last parameter is access to market. It is important that the ecosystem of local content practice have this piece in place as the ultimate goal driving all practitioners. The policies or laws, the capacities developed, and the research and development effort should become frustrating if there is no outlet to utilize them and receive reward for sustainability and growth. At NCDMB, we have enabled access to market by ensuring that patronage of goods and services that are generated from established capacities using the right of first refusal principle, using our various project certification tools. The point here is that in the oil and gas industry, quality and standards are not compromised. Because imagine ultra deep, almost 306 kilometers of water, you have substandard products that you put within 3.6 kilometers of water, where human beings cannot go. Imagine the disaster. Therefore, standard and quality must not be compromised while dealing with local content. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, a sustainable local content practice is essential for development, empowerment, prosperity, and creation of employment opportunities. We made this mistake in Nigeria, where we neglected local communities and was going ahead as if they never existed. And then when the crisis started within the Niger Delta region, where we were producing oil and gas, from 2 million barrels, we reduced ourselves to 500,000 barrels because the communities refused us to produce until we had to think twice on how to get them involved beyond the community and also Nigerians. Namibia, please don't make that mistake. A world-class practice requires that the right regulatory framework is put in place, regular gap analysis are carried out, and the setting of targets for gap closure is done. The right resources, including funding and incentives, are required to build capacities and capability. Research and development are key drivers for innovations and access to market. It is essential to ensure patronage and long-term sustainability. In Nigeria, country, because there is a legal basis with which you have established that investment, and as somebody who has built the capacity in country, you have the right to take anybody to court that is contravening the provisions of the law. In closing, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would like to especially thank you and ask you to do your best to avoid the Dodge disease, even though the Dodge themselves did not die of the disease, in which the rapid development of the oil and gas industry leads to decline in other sectors of the Namibian economy. The existing era of oil and gas discovery and its development should not lead to decline or abandonment of your mining, fishing, agriculture, and tourism sector of the economy. Huge salary disparities, concentration of development in city centers, importation of foreign taste and lifestyle, display of affluence, corruption, misapplication of oil and gas revenues, and many other factors promote the shift from the pre-existing sectors towards the oil and gas sector. Namibia must put in place mechanisms to prevent this from happening in your country. Once again, a big thank you to the Namibia ambassador, the honorary counselor to Nigeria, and the organizers of this event for inviting me. I wish the government and the people of Namibia wonderful outcomes as they deepen local content practice in the country, using the opportunities presented by exploration and exploitation of the oil and gas industry. There's more to talk about, but like you can see, the problem director is on my right side. I have no option. Thank you very much.